other people to sign in, and then we'll get started.
Where is Iseki Kai? Why is nobody here from the club?
We had this session last night, and there were some people from California Iseki Kai part of that.
Yeah.
So this is a repeat of that. And we're having this repeat because we have some viewers from Europe. And we also have viewers from Asia, and we can't cover both in the same presentation.
Okay.
So we have to do two sessions, one for the Asian community and one for North America and Europe.
Wow.
Okay, well, let's get underway. Welcome to VSANA seminars. I want to say good morning to our West Coast people, good evening to our East Coast North American people, and or good afternoon to our West Coast people, East Coast, and good evening to our European audience. I expect more people will be joining us as we get underway. These seminars are free programs to inform Suiseki and viewing stone enthusiasts worldwide about the art of stone appreciation. At this time, I'd like to ask you to mute your microphone, and you can send questions to us anytime via the chat during the program. Now, about 2/3 of the way through the program, we're going to ask for your input on some slides and some displays, and I'll tell you at that time to unmute your microphone. And then at the end, you'll have a chance to enter into a discussion and ask questions of Richard or myself about the program. Now, today's program is Design Principles in Contemporary Viewing Stone Displays. It's brought to you by the Viewing Stone Association of North America, VSANA, and we encourage you to visit our website, www.vsana.org, and you'll find over 1,500 photographs of stones on this site and many articles. If you'd like to be on our mailing list to receive a notice about the website updates, new videos, or notices of future seminars, just let me know. The program today, joining me today is Richard Turner, Professor Emeritus at Chapman University, Orange, California. Richard is a studio artist, has been practicing art for his lifetime, and also a talented professor, teacher, instructor at Chapman. And he has a long-standing interest in stones and stone appreciation, particularly in new ways of expressing stones. Now, if we look at displays, we know that an effective display will grab your attention immediately and hold it. And viewing stone displays have been strongly influenced by traditional methods, Japanese methods, and these have been based primarily upon the tokonoma, as you see here in the illustration. But there are other ways to display stones that might be better suited for today's homes, apartments, and lifestyles. So today, we're going to look at some of the principles behind a good display, if it's contemporary, traditional, or whatever. Now, in preparation for this, Richard came over to my garage studio. We got a number of stones out, tables, accessory items, and spent many hours putting together displays that I then photographed, and we're using those in this display today. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Richard, who's going to lead you through this and inform all of us about the basic principles of design. Richard, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom. As we say in this slide here, the principles of design are overlapping and interdependent, which means that you can't really talk about one without talking about the other one. You can't separate these out. Nonetheless, that's exactly what I'm going to try to do. Next slide. Just as looking at this Japanese Kamo River stone, you know it has texture, you know it has color, but you can't separate those two from each other. They are totally interdependent, and that's exactly the way these principles are, overlapping and interdependent, but I'm going to try to separate them out, and hopefully by the end of this short talk, we'll see how they actually work together. Next one. So, scale and proportion. Scale is the relative size of an object. Proportion is the relationship of parts to each other or to the whole. Now, scale and proportion are the easiest of these principles to talk about in relationship to stones, because scale is one of the things that probably drew most of us to viewing stone appreciation in the first place. Next one. Within a rock the size of a fist can be assembled the beauty of 1,000 cliffs. And I know we've all experienced or had that experience where we've looked at a stone like the one on the right that evokes a waterfall, or the one on the left that evokes a mountain range. And we've looked at that stone and kind of taken cues from the scale of the stone and imagined much larger expanses of landscapes, a huge cliff face with a waterfall tumbling down it, or a mountain range off in the distance. We have literally held in the palm of our hands huge swaths of landscape. And that's what is exciting about viewing stones, is that they are interactive kinds of phenomena. They're not something that you just sit there and look at. They're things that you participate in that spark your imagination to imagine vaster vistas. Next one. So now I want to look at how does that scale work with regard to individual stones. Let's look at the stone on the right, which would be classified as a distant mountain stone. Now, part of the reason that we understand this is a distant mountain stone is because of the scale of the detail. The scale of this detail is very tiny, which is exactly how it would be if we were standing 4 or 5 miles from this mountain and seeing the top of it peek out over a sea of clouds. Not only could we not see much detail on the mountain itself from 4 or 5 miles away, because the naked eye can't see that far clearly, but there's also 4 or 5 miles worth of atmosphere between ourselves and the mountain, and that would tend to blur that detail. Now, if we look at the stone on the left, this stone is more representative of a mesa or a relatively nearby cliff face. And the reason that we can understand this stone differently has to do with the scale of the detail. We can see the layering in the stone. We can see the changes in color in the stone. We can see the cracks in the surface. We can see the crevices between the parts of it. We'd have to be 100, maybe 200 yards away from this stone to see this kind of detail. So here we take cues from the scale of the detail in the stone in order to read it as either a cliff face that's not that far away or a distant mountain stone. Next one. Scale is not necessarily inherent in the stone itself. It can be manipulated by pairing a stone with objects that suggest a specific familiar size. So let's look at this stone in combination with a sequence of progressively larger objects. Next one. So look at the stone, look at the image on the left. Imagine yourself sitting in that chair and your head would probably come up to maybe a little bit higher than that, somewhere around there. And so the rest of the stone there would be maybe 3, 4 or more feet above your head. So the whole stone could be 7, 8, 9 feet tall. Now, if you were sitting in the chair on the right-hand side, which is a larger chair, the stone gets proportionately smaller and your head would probably be close to where the top of the stone is, but the stone would still be higher than your seated figure. Next one. Now, on the left, we have a still larger chair. And the stone gets smaller again. Your head would probably be right about at the, would be right about at the top of the stone. And then in this rattan, well, this model of a rattan chair on the right, your head would be higher than the stone itself. And the stone would have shrunk to maybe 3 feet high, 3.5 feet high, 4 feet high, something like that. And then finally, look at the stone next to, next slide, next to a stool where you would be sitting and your feet would be on the ground and the stone has come down to what its objective size is, which is probably around 6 or 8 inches. So size is an objective measurement. Scale is a relative one. The size of the stone has stayed the same. Its scale has changed depending on what we've put it with. Next one. Proportion is the relationship of parts to the whole or to each other. And proportion is a slightly more slippery concept, but it is kind of a first cousin to scale. And if we look at the display on the right-hand side, I'd say that the proportion of the stone to the table is fairly harmonious. Now I'm looking at the one on the left-hand side, excuse me, Tom. The scale is fairly harmonious here. That is, there's enough space on the table to allow the stone to sort of be itself. Whereas if we look at the stone on the right-hand side, this table is small, it is spindly, and it is way too small for the stone. It holds the stone up, but it doesn't, it's almost like the stone is doing some kind of high wire balancing act in order to balance on top of this table. So that's a distraction. And this is the first time I want to say, and I will say it numerous times during this lecture, that the point of doing these displays is always to show the stone in its best light. So anything that detracts from showing the stone at its best light is incompatible with a harmonious or successful or unified display. Next one. Now, here we have another distraction. We've got the same table that we started out with, which is pretty, I would say, big enough for the stone. We've reversed the position of the stone, but we've got some little tchotchkes down here on the table. Next slide. And these little figurines are a man poling a boat and a model of a pagoda. But these two objects are out of proportion with each other. Either the man is too big for the pagoda or the pagoda is too small for the man. In either case, the proportions are off here. Next one. and they are off in relationship to the stone itself. They are a distraction because they're so small, and they take our gaze away from the stone, and they don't do anything to build any sort of a narrative about the stone because they're such a distraction. We look at the stone and then we look down and go, what are those little things and what are they doing there? Next one. Balance. Balance is a state of equilibrium or equalized tension that may be either harmonious or dynamic. Next slide. The basic forms of balance are symmetrical and asymmetrical. Now, this stone is a fairly symmetrical stone. It's almost a sphere or a globe. And it doesn't, because it's a very self-contained stone, and it doesn't engage the space around it in a very dynamic way. So it makes sense to exhibit it in a symmetrical way so that there's about the same amount of space on both sides of the stone, and it's aligned with the axis of the most intense decoration in the table there, right in the center below where the stone is set. This may be the best way to show this stone, maybe a little on the boring side, but it's certainly a solid, calm, harmonious use of symmetrical balance. Next one. Asymmetrical balance is often much more frequently used in stone display, and it's a more complex dynamic. So let's take a look at this particular stone on the table here, and it's set off to the left-hand side a bit. And there are good reasons for this. First of all, look at the way the stone comes up and moves off to the left a bit. Then it bends over to the right, and then there's a little protuberance on the top that kind of takes your attention off to the upper left. And then look at the right-hand side of the stone. This edge, which has a lot of complexity to it, is sort of a concave curve that engages all of this space that is defined by the edge of the stone there and the top of the table. So all of that space there is a part of that display. Whereas if you look at the left-hand contour of the stone, if this were a figure stone, you could say it's sort of turning its back towards that space. So it would make sense that if the stone is turning its back towards some space, make that space a little smaller because that's not as important, and make the other space larger because that's what the stone is engaging. And that's kind of the heart of asymmetrical balance. The space around the stone means almost as much as the stone itself. Next one. Asymmetrical or dynamic balance is traditionally recommended for the display of a stone in a suiban. Many of you are probably very familiar with this, so this will be a review for you, but let's go on to the next one. The effective, next one.
Okay.
There we go. The effective use of asymmetrical balance requires a careful study of the stone and its relationship to the space of the suiban. The shape and directionality of the stone determine its placement in the suiban. And for those of you who collect and display stones, you can immediately see what is lacking in this display. The directionality of this stone goes from right to left, and as our gaze goes from the top of the stone down this smooth slope and ends in the suiban, what happens? But immediately our gaze bumps into the edge of the suiban. It's kind of like a crash landing for our gaze. Next one. But if you simply employ asymmetrical balance and bring the stone back towards the right, you see that as your gaze once again goes along the surface of that stone and comes down to land in the suiban, you've got much more space there before you reach the edge of the suiban, and the display is therefore more harmonious. And if you were to look at this stone as something that was moving, the stone itself would have more potential space to move through as well. Next one. Similarity and contrast. Shared similarities among objects is a basic tool for establishing unity in a composition. Unity that embraces variety is more effective than harmony that relies solely on similarities. So let's look at 3 displays that hopefully illustrate this principle. Next one. In this first one, I think there is too much variety, too much contrast. That is, you've got a tall, thin stone there on the left-hand side. You've got a couple of mountain stones. You've got this bulbous stone in the center. You've got a very bright white one below that. Then you've got an intensely colored one on the bottom. The stones in and of themselves are interesting, but there's just too much going on here to make for a harmonious or unified display. Next one. Here, on the other hand, this is immediately much more harmonious because you've got 3 stones that have 2 peaks to them, 2 stones that have a single peak to them, and then all of the stones are pretty much in the same kind of color and size range. But I would say this is probably harmonious to the point of being boring. Next one. Here, I think this is one option for a display that makes use of both unity and contrast, or variety, or contrast and unity, and that, or contrast and similarity, excuse me. We've got a couple of mountain stones. We've got some stones that vary in size. We've got one stone that's fairly brightly colored, but not as bright as the previous stones that were in the display. So there is some variety here, some contrast, and there is some similarity. It's not as great as the variety in the first one. It's not as complete as the similarities in the second one, but I think there's a possible balance here. And I want to say here something that I would also repeat, and that is there's never a single solution to the display of a stone. There are always multiple ways of displaying stones that flatter or make use of the basic beauty of the stone itself. So this is one possibility that it works. Let's go on to the next one. Hierarchy and emphasis. The hierarchy of a display is an ordering of elements so as to lead the viewer's eye through the arrangement from the most important element to the least important and back again. Next slide. Keeping in mind that what we want to do is to show the stone to its best advantage. Let's start with the display on the left-hand side. Here you've got a beautiful base, but it's bulky, it's ornate with lots and lots of detail. It is very dark. It takes up a lot of room, and beautiful though it is, I think my eye at least goes to the base as much as it does to the stone. So looking at the table on the right, it's a bit of an improvement. It's a lighter, airier base. It's not as bulky. There's a little more space on top of the table to sort of give the stone room to be itself. But then there are details on the table that kind of detract my attention from the stone. The beautiful way the edges of the table curve up, this bright band of bamboo decoration that is right below the top of the table, and then the nice way that the legs splay out at the bottom. It's a very attractive table, and in a way it may be just a little too attractive, so that it competes with the stone. It doesn't contribute to focusing your eye on the stone. Next one. This table, I think, works a little better than either one of the two previous ones. First of all, it's got a commodious top. There's a lot of space there. And this stone in particular needs a lot of space because it's such an unusual and dramatically angled stone. It's not a simple stone at all, so it needs more space to be itself. And this table provides that. Secondly, the table is relatively simple in its construction. Thirdly, these negative spaces on the legs of the table on the right-hand side and the left-hand side, they sort of echo the negative space in the center of the stone itself. And the kind of curling motifs at the bottom of the legs echo the more squared off or angular versions of what's going on in the legs of the daisa. So there are a number of things that support the stone rather than detracting from it. This again may not be the perfect or the best version for display of this stone, but it's certainly better, in my opinion at least, than the two previous ones. Next one. The last principle is unity and harmony. When all of the components of a composition are in agreement, we can say that the composition is unified and harmonious. And here, we're actually talking about all of the principles together. Next one. So we'll take another look at this Japanese Kamo River stone. And this stone by itself on a daisa, this may be the best, most unified and harmonious way of displaying this stone. I don't know, but let's look at a couple of other ways of displaying it. Next one. Yes, I'm glad I heard that. This is intentionally the worst display that Tom and I could come up. Well, I suppose we could come up with worse ones, but for purposes of the talk, we put this together. First of all, the stone is obviously way too big for the suiban. The suiban is also way too bright for the darkness of the stone. The coarseness of the gravel is too coarse for the delicate detail on the stone. And then the variegated colors of the gravel there's too much going on in the gravel, and that also detracts from the stone. So this is basically a disaster. This is what we're starting from. Next one. Now here, we've remedied this slightly. We've increased the size of the suiban. We have also substituted a sand, that is much finer than the gravel, and the variety of colors in the sand is not as great as the tonalities in the gravel, plus the detail on the edge of the suiban is delicate in proportion to the delicacy of the detail in the stone itself, and the darkness of the suiban is related to the darkness of the stone. Of course, as you all know, the stone's in the wrong place in the suiban. So let's go to the next slide and we move it over. We employ asymmetrical balance for this stone that's got the same directionality as an earlier stone that we've seen. And we've got plenty of room for our gaze as it goes from the top of the stone down the mountain range and lands in the sand of the suiban. Next one. So that may have been a pretty good way of displaying the stone, but let's look at another couple of ways as well. On the left, we've got a stone, we've got a table that we've seen before, but this time the table looks too small for the stone. And in fact, in my opinion, at least, it is too small for the stone, and it's too light colored. And I think that the detail, the legs particularly, are too, I don't know, they're too fancy, I guess, for the simplicity of the stone and the daisa that holds it. The table on the right is more commodious. I think it is better proportion to the size of the stone. The darkness of the table comes closer to the tone of the stone and the daisa. The rounded nature of the detail of the carving of the table relates to the rounded nature and the curves of the daisa itself. But I think the table is a little heavy and a little bulky for the delicacy of the detail of the stone. Next one. This might be, at least in my opinion, a slightly better matching of a table with a stone. And I say that because the color of the table is much closer to the color of the daisa. The kind of gentle curves of the legs of the table relate to the curves of the daisa. The size of the table is big enough for the stone, and the simplicity of the design of the table overall doesn't, I think, detract from the stone. But of course, we could go on and there would be even more interesting and appropriate ways of displaying this stone in a way that is successful and brings out the inherent beauty of the stone itself. Next one. So now that you've got some understanding of design for viewing stone displays, we'd like to ask you what you think about some of the following displays. And we've put together a couple displays here that we think need some work. So if you want to unmute yourselves and comment on this, let's go to the next slide. How would you suggest improving this display, keeping in mind that what we're trying to do here is to show the stone off to its best advantage? What would you do what would anybody do to this display?
Hire an exterminator.
Excellent, excellent work. Would you exterminate all of the crabs or most of them or what?
All of them.
Okay,
Just the big ones.
just the big ones, leave the small ones. Any other thoughts?
Because right now, the biggest crab is the dominant element in the arrangement. So you want to move the location of the big stone so that it has a more less off to the side position. And on that base, maybe the shape of the base even needs to change because it draws you out in both directions.
Okay, how about look at this version of the display?
Next one.
Next one. Is this an improvement or just another mistake?
It's a big improvement.
Yep. I agree.
And why is that?
You see the stone more.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's the display is not nearly as cluttered. I think that one problem with this display, though, is that the stone and the little crab are so far away that my eye is kind of going back and forth between the two.
That's true.
And, so that causes a little disharmony in this display.
So that goes to the idea of not having the stone on the right side off to this, you know, it's not, it needs to move a little bit.
So move towards the left and more towards the center then?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, a little bit.
okay. What about these next examples? Next slide, Tom. You think either of these are any better?
Yeah, the top one.
One of the people in last night's version of this seminar suggested that either of these could work, but that his suggestion was that the top one was a little more successful and turn the stone around so that the narrative might be that the crab might be moving to climb onto the stone, which I thought that's a pretty interesting approach to this, and that might work as well. And I agree that the top one works better than the bottom one. The bottom one, the crab is still pretty large and pretty dark and detracts you from looking at the stone.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next one. How would anybody improve either of these two displays?
Remove some stones.
Which ones would you remove?
It depends. Okay, I'd maybe put the flower stones in the center and try that with nothing on the sides.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
And why would you do that? What would be the advantage of that?
Well, they're pretty spectacular stones, you know, and they demand attention. So anything else on the sides is going to be secondary.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that on the top display particularly, that stone is so spectacular. The other stones look kind of drab in comparison to it. And in the way that one of the stones that we've been using for several of the displays is just so complex that it demands a lot of space around it. The shape of this stone is not that complex, but the patterning and color certainly is. And so this stone needs a lot of space to be itself. Any other suggestions on what might be done here other than getting rid of some of the stones?
Well, if you're going to get rid of the stones, then you need, I think, a different base. I like that base. I think it's interesting, but I don't think that I don't know. I mean, I have to look at it and see what it would look like with just one stone on it. But or maybe
why would you say get a different base?
Well, because you've got 3 bays, and the eye wants to fill those bays. So if you have something on the side, if you have the stone in the center, then you have 2 empty bays. Maybe that's okay. I can't quite see it. I think for me, it would be better on just one of those bays.
Well, that's an interesting comment because last night, one person suggested that we turn the whole thing over.
Yes.
He assumed that it was flat on the bottom. It probably isn't flat on the bottom, but if it were flat on the bottom and we turned the whole thing over, then you would get rid of the bays and you would have room for just a single stone and you wouldn't have the tendency to want to fill in those bays. Could I have the next slide, Tom? And then another person said, what if you just kept one stone like the one on the left-hand side and left the other two bays empty? And his reasoning was that the stone on the left-hand side looks like what is called a coastal stone. It looks like a stone that might suggest a cave in an inlet along the ocean, and that the piece of wood looked like ocean waves in a way. And I thought, well, that's an interesting approach to it. But in either case, it was too many stones. Now, what do you think about this arrangement? Is this also too many stones, or does this work any better?
Yes, because they don't relate to each other.
In what way?
They just don't, they're not the same kind of stone. They're, the first one is a cave, the second one is a pillar, and the third one is a doban. Let's see.
Plateau.
Doha. I mean, this is a really interesting stone, and I mean, I think I could look at this one longer than these two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that these displays work because they're three different kinds of stones, but they're in the same general color range, and they don't repeat each other. They don't dramatically detract from each other, but at the same time, maybe they do, maybe just two, or maybe simply one would work better than all three of them together. Another comment from last night was, if you look at the stone on the right takes your eye towards the center, but if you look at the base for the stone on the right, it seems to be taking your eye off to the left-hand side rather than towards the center. So there's some problems with this display as well, but certainly something worth playing around with. Next one. Have the next slide, Tom? Great.
That's pretty.
So we have been purposefully illustrating all of these principles of design using traditional modes of display, because that's what most of you are familiar with. At the same time, we know that most of us, myself included, don't have a huge library of tables and suibans and accompanying figurines and whatnot that we can readily go to and make or modify displays so that we get something that is the best possible display given what we've got. So as some of you know, Tom and I and Paul Harris have written a book on contemporary stone display, and that's something that interests us, and it's something that is more practical for most of us in terms of displaying our stones. So we're going to end with two displays that are contemporary in nature, but talk about them using the same principles as we use to talk about the more traditional displays. So this one is a piece of petrified wood, which is not a traditional stone to collect. And this is a cutting board, which is not a traditional piece of material to use to display the stone on. But if we look at it, we could say that there is some unity to this display as a result of the coloration of the stone and the coloration of the board. We could say there's some harmony here because of the kind of vertical striations in the stone and the horizontal striations or the horizontal stripes in the cutting board. We could say there is a a kind of unity in the rounded edges of the stone, particularly on the top part, and the rounded edges of the cutting board. And then when we look at the directionality of the stone, we see that the directionality of the stone is that it goes from the lower left towards the upper right, and then it comes down the face, the right-hand face, and your gaze then kind of pools out on the edge of the cutting board in the same way that it would in the Diza with the stone that had the directionality that took it in the opposite direction. So there are things that are happening here that are related to the same kinds of things that go on in a traditional display. Another thing about this display, before we leave it, is that if you think about things like Chinese display, where the base plays a much more active role, we could look at this and say this is perhaps influenced by Chinese display because of the fact that the base, the cutting board itself, is certainly something that you look at. It's like a back and forth between the petrified wood and the base. And so this might be thought of as more of a sculpture that has a stone as a major component in it, rather than a display that is intended to highlight just the stone itself, which is kind of the gist of a lot of traditional Japanese forms of displays. And let's go to the next slide and the final display here, Tom. This display was inspired by thinking about Chinese scholars sitting at their desks with stones beside them that they would look at occasionally while they were in the course of painting or doing calligraphy or writing reports for their employers or simply paying bills. We 20th century scholars would be doing all of that on our laptops. So I thought that displaying a laptop together with a stone would be challenging, and it also kind of would work as a bridge between the 11th century and the 21st century. This was for me a challenging display because the two things are so different, a laptop and a chrysanthemum stone. But the way that I finally decided to put them together relies on the same formal principles as a traditional display, so that the black of the screen and the dark gray of the chrysanthemum stone relate to each other. The silver tone of the keyboard and the off-white brightness of the flowers in the chrysanthemum stone kind of speak to each other. The intricate detail of the flowers on the chrysanthemum stone and the more regular detail of the keyboard, those kind of play off of each other. I think the main thing is that positioning the stone so that the left-hand profile of the stone angles out and down, and then the right-hand profile of the open laptop provides an angle that receives the angle of the stone. So there's a kind of dynamic space between the stone and the laptop because of the rough proximity of those two angles that works as well. And then there's also the sheen of the stone and the sheen of the screen of the laptop. And then finally, the stone is literally the tallest thing in the display. And so it kind of works in terms of the hierarchy of the objects. The lines established by the laptop the bottom, the middle, and the top all lead you towards the stone itself. And there is that stone with its beautiful, irregular detail of these wonderful chrysanthemum flowers. So there you have it. And let's go on to the next slide, Tom.
Well, thank you, Richard. If you want to learn more about viewing stone displays, we recommend this book, Contemporary Viewing Stone Display, to you. There's an entire chapter in the book on display written by Richard Turner. It's very good and well illustrated. We recommend it to you. You can get this book at a discount by going to the bookshop on the www.VSANA.org website. Now, if you're interested in learning more about contemporary viewing stone displays by Richard, you can go to his website at turnerprojects.com, or you can go to his Instagram site at Richard544, or his Twin Brothers site at Richard Turner 6179. And you can see quite an array of beautiful designs. Now I'm going to switch the presentation off and we can enter into a discussion among ourselves and with Richard. And we encourage you to ask questions, give us your opinion, and let us know what you think. That's how we can improve the